And then there are the stories that aren't written. Of these images, this is really my family, and I'll just take a few minutes because these stories are powerful. How many of you have really, well, maybe not. My father's story is in the book, in my dissertation, and I'll just quickly describe it to you. During the war, he's riding a caravan cart with his wife, who's full of child. She is so pregnant. And they come to a sentry post, and he stops the caravan cart. As they're taught, as they're required to, if you don't follow the rules, you get beaten. So he stops the cart, and he gets off the cart, and he calls his wife, Mala, because you're supposed to bow, and you're supposed to bow a certain way. And she's so big with child, it's hot, and she says, Potlaha, it's okay. And so he gets down, bows, and immediately these soldiers come up, they drag her off the cart, and they beat her. They kick her, they just brutalized her. And so I asked my father, and remember, it took me years and years and years. He says, Lani de Patricia, why are you always so curious? Why are you insisting? Why are you asking these questions? And he told me, in response to my question, what did you do? Couldn't you, what happened? And he says, Patty, told me. There's nothing that you could do. And I was like, I'm thinking like, shoot, I'd be kicking some ass, right? And he says, who's going to take care of the kids if I die? So they stop beating her, picks her up, takes her home. And that's what you do. Do you think that was easy for him to do? No. My mother, a beautiful single woman during the time, she witnessed a family of 3 daughters. This informed how she was supposed to behave as a single woman. And attractive at that is that she watched this family, and they needed women to serve them. And so they would rip the shirts off the women, one at a time, sisters. They would cut the breasts off and then execute them. And the parents are watching this. The community is watching this. And so they do it to the second one, and the third one, none of them go. So she learned, if I go into Hagatnya, or anywhere that there's a group of people, I am not going to be attractive, I'm going to be dirty, and I'm probably going to be stinky. Why? Because she saw what happened to these females. My uncle over there, his story is that he was in a work group. I'm taking too long, I'm sorry. He was in a work group, and he was just handpicked out of a group and said, you, the Japanese soldiers, and they were told to dig a hole. And this was in response to my uncle, how come you're not going to the liberation? What does liberation mean to you? I come and go on these trips, and I was curious. I visited him Liberation Day, and he's at home by himself. I'm here there with my mom, and he says, I will never go to one of those. And so he tells me the story. He's in a group. They pull him out randomly. They're told to dig a hole, and they're told to kneel down in front of the hole, and one of the soldiers just kicks him in the hole, and they're told to bury him. They can hear this man saying, "Timamataizu, I am not dead." So these are stories. Now, I inherited those stories. I'm sharing them with you so that you can see that there are more stories that were never told. I asked my siblings, the one on the left and the right and the bottom, what was it like? I'm really umbilicera. What was it like? And they said, hi, Patty, we were just kids. As I got older, and they got older, they would say it was really, really bad. You know, my sister in the middle, they were at Menengun, and she's passed on already. So 2 of my siblings, Tita and David, who I never knew, she was the one who was supposed to take care of them, the little ones. And David and Tita were both very sick, starving and dying of malnutrition. And everybody thought that it was going to be Tita who died, it was David. How does she survive not being able to take care of her siblings? It's very tough. She doesn't talk about it. It's her siblings that talk about it. My siblings. They share those stories. So we need internal validation within like my family, within our culture. But more important, that these are real stories. They're not made up. These stories are like too horrific to make up. But even so, there are many layers of the story. What I've found is that they will only reveal what they think you can tolerate. So I grew up where we would laugh because it was like, Lani, all they did was laugh. Because when I was young, you know. Even my mother, Frances, would say, hi, all I heard was these funny stories. And I'm sure it wasn't always bad, but those bad moments lasted. And many of them repeated over and over, just in different ways. So that's part of the internal validation, and the external validation is even more important. That's what we're looking for right now. When validation is not forthcoming, the community senses a sense of helplessness. The United States didn't even recognize our National Guard as Americans. Anybody notice that one? There's only the people in Anderson and Naval Station. So even our soldiers, who are American soldiers, were not counted. So validation is important. And there are many things that are considered secret. Secreto, no? Mga masangan. Don't say those things. They're forbidden because it makes people feel uncomfortable, embarrassed for them. Now, this is an external validation that I found incredibly powerful. Jose University invited the 3 of us, Hope Ristobal, myself, and si Tanwanita Cruz. She's a Surahana. And apparently she had shared her story, and it was so powerful that someone in the audience said, we want you to come and tell the story. Now, Japan is not known for teaching the history of the war in their schools. But we were invited, and there's a grassroots movement of people, of professors, students, band members, someone worked at FedEx. These are just people in the community who wanted to be a part. They wanted to know, they wanted to understand so that it wouldn't happen again. That's external validation. And so they wanted to hear her story. And every year they save up money and they bring in somebody else. They even bring soldiers who were a part of the atrocities that occurred throughout the Pacific and Asia. Her story is so horrific. And I would help her tell the story. But I was also there to support her. And then Hope was doing her part to educate and inform the people there about who we are and our challenges. Okay? So that was one example of external validation of an experience. They even had soldiers come in to talk to them about the things they did, which is very shameful, because some of the things they did were unconscionable. But they wanted to know, so it wouldn't happen again, partly because it's not taught in their schools. So moving right along, when I'm talking about trauma, intergenerational, I want you to think of storms, different storms. who we were as ancient Chamorros? We were very organized. The things that were written about us were that we were loving, we were tolerant parents. We weren't abusive. We didn't exercise external discipline. What we did was we taught them. We weren't necessarily aggressive or violent. We were respectful. We were self-sustaining. We had a structure. We had rules. And we followed them. And in the beginning, in the history, there were over 100,000 people living in the Mariana Islands. 100,000 Chamorro people. Imagine that. And then through time, they were highly organized. They were described as easily pleased, well-mannered, hospitable, tractable, with a complex mixture of playfulness. They liked to joke. They liked to tease. They were stubbornly persistent. And there was only one note of violence in the records. They valued reciprocity in relationships, fine craftsmen, so forth. They were described as ingenious, meaning that we learn quickly. We were adaptable. And so the violent storms in our history starts with the Japanese occupation, naval administration, and so forth. I think everybody here I'll just move through them quickly. In the Japanese and the Spanish occupation, many changes. Enslavement. We talk about repopulation. There's so many people that were hunted down, chased from one island to the next, because we refused to be controlled. We fought back. Many of our people died because of disease, but also an active effort to control us. Why? Because the Spanish still needed people to farm and provide food for the galleons that were coming through. As a consequence, there were many losses. Lost the art of the men because they targeted the men, even boys. If they picked up a stick, a rock, and fought back, they were also targeted for elimination. So who was left? Who was left? The women. And the people who couldn't fight, some of the children, but once they just exhibited behaviors that they could challenge the authority, they were killed. So then there were the women. What do you have to do? You have to repopulate the island, right? And so they brought people on the ships. They brought men to have children. So do you think the women really wanted to have children from all these people from the Americas, the Native Americas, Filipinos, any man they could throw on a ship in Europe? Do you think they were excited about having kids? Lani, I'm on Guam again. Talk to me. Do you think they were excited? No. No, and they actually didn't want to have kids because they knew these children were going to be slaves. And so begins the history of sexual abuse. And eventually the women came to terms with the idea that we would die as a people if we didn't have children. If you took medicine or you exercised infanticide, because you don't want your children to be slaves. That's part of our history. And throughout this period, we were ancestor worshippers pre-Spanish, and they demonized our ancestors. Tautamona is evil. They'll make you sick. But how you go from being an ancestor worshiper to thinking of your ancestors as evil? That was part of the colonization process. Matapang, a chief who stood up against forced religious indoctrination. His name is besmirched. You're silly. You're a silly man. But he stood up Hurrah. So we lost the way of life, our spiritual beliefs, our practices. People were now buried, which was not our practice. Histories are distorted. We lose control. However, after 370 years of colonization, is that we reached a point of relative calm. Life was an agrarian society. And in an agrarian society, if I have a lot of bananas, I share with my neighbors. And maybe when they have eggplants or whatever they have, they share with me. And so you had to get along with people. And you had to share, right? I want you to remember that value and what values we have today. You shared, you made things, you shared, you took care of each other. You worked together. And then came the end of the colonial rule with the Spanish-American War in 1898. McKinley, he referred to us as indolent savages, lazy people. Military governors were given full authority for the land and the people. The people here in Guam didn't own land. They had no voice, they had no country. They had no political identity. Working together, this is in 1913, fishermen. And then Agatha Johnson. We have a school named after her. She was like the first one, I mean not the first, but a female that is well known for education, but more that she stood up when she knew that there was something the Americans were doing that was unacceptable. She would storm right into their office, the office of the admiral or whoever was in charge, and say, "You will not shave the head of that woman." So now you have to remember that the military is a patriarchal system. The United States is a patriarchal society. And are we a patriarchal society at this time? No, we are and we were a matriarchal society. Women were treated respectfully. And so the military governors were very uncomfortable with our role. Sexual freedom. And that women at that time didn't always marry, in spite of Catholicism. They had children from multiple partners. And when the Americans came in, they thought, like, what the hell? And they forced people to marry. They forced them to, if they were with someone, oh, you're married. If you don't want to get married, you can't live in sin. So they actually enforced a value. And so people were forced to marry and adopt the children, give the children their last name even though it wasn't theirs. You know how complicated, how many of your Chamorros, how complicated it is to unravel, oh, your father is, and you're trying to figure out how you're related? Well, it's complicated. So they imposed that the men were the head of the household. Figure that one. So it forced the role of a matriarchal society where the women would make their husband take like accolades or take responsibility even though they weren't the ones. So time passed, the pateras on the left, and this is in 1925 with Stella Pangilinan. Schools, and this is a pageant. After all, it's America. Sports. My dad was a boxer. Big baseball was huge. But the bottom line is that kalanhit got lago. We were like dogs. Loss of control of our land, and repeated requests for citizenship was denied. And it actually goes against, and it's highlighted in the media, that it goes against that the United States is a democracy and all men are created equal, but we were definitely not equal because we weren't even claimed as citizens. Kalanhit magahit gatlago. We were told where to go, what we could and couldn't do. But they were at least, they weren't brutal. They weren't out to murder us. The pain of neglected, the women's roles were lost. And here's a family and the Japanese attacked. Now, you know, when I was attending the University of, am I doing okay? Oh, good. When I was attending the University of Massachusetts, and it got around what I was studying. And so I was invited to meet a dean. And you know, I've moved so many times that I've lost the dean's name. But he was really excited to hear that I was from Guam. And he was telling me that he had worked here. He was in the service. And he looks at me and he says, "You do know what happened, right?" And I was like, I'm not sure what you're talking about. What do I know what happened? And he says, "You know, you guys were abandoned." And he validated and this was years ago. He validated my understanding, and he knew that Guam was abandoned. And now it's out, it's known. The only way that the United States could get into a war that they resisted to get involved in in Europe was they had to allow an event to happen that would force them to participate in World War II. But you can't go years ignoring what was happening all over Europe, and Nazi Germany, and all over Europe, and not participate and then just say, "Oh, by the way, we want to play now." No, they had to have an event. So they knew, and this is declassified. They knew that Guam and Hawaii was going to be attacked because they moved military personnel and their dependents. But if they were Chamorro women, they didn't go. The only dependent who wasn't on the ship to evacuate from Guam prior to our war here on Guam was a pregnant woman. She stayed, and then she eventually was taken as a prisoner of war. So unless their wives were Chamorro, they were not evacuated along with everybody else. Okay? And then Japan invaded. And you know, I get in trouble. And when I'm in forums like this, I've actually been called unpatriotic. I've been called a liar. You're lying. It's not true. Those things didn't happen. How can you say that? Like, I hope I don't offend any people who are Japanese. I've been even called unpatriotic by Chamorros and liars by Chamorros. I've also been called, you know, like, how can you lie, by the Japanese international students who would be in my audience, because they never heard about what happened here. And so when they never heard about it, it's like, why are you saying that about my people? And I'm like, holy cow, girl, you need to learn. Very painful for her and for me, because she had no inkling. So, anyway, usually I do the disclaimer in the beginning, I'm sorry. So don't be mad, okay? And if you're mad, you can talk to me about it. So Japan, the marches. On the left, by the way, is the young Father Dueñas. Death, loss of property, enslavement. We were forced to learn the Japanese language, their values, their practices. You had to bow a certain way, otherwise you were beaten. And that's just a small part of it. They're brutal, the stories that you share. And I think some of the stories, you're only still getting the surface, because it's hard to reveal more. The forced marches, the concentration camps, death by illness or by assaults. The rice paddies on the right. The schools, notice all the children had bobs. And the nurses. Death was, people feared. There was a fear of constant war, death, atrocities, and so forth. What we learned here was that if somebody stood up if somebody said anything, your family could die. So actually, it was better when people became invisible. Pakakapatot mo. This idea that children are seen and not heard. Actually, sometimes in some families, children are not seen. They're hit. Once somebody comes through the door, they're like sent to hide. These are maladaptive practices that continue today in some families. So if you, even just raising your hand, I tease because I'm back on Guam. In States, people would raise their hand, they would argue, they discuss. Here in Guam, trying to get students to raise their hand is like pulling teeth until they can trust you, right? So people didn't want to stand out. That's part of the explanation of why people don't want to share their stories, aside from the pain. Because to tell a story is you almost have to be there. So when I work with clients, my clients, I teach them to tell the story from afar. Just tell a story. Especially if they're distraught, they're crying. So the first time they may cry, they may not even finish the story. The second time, and then I teach them, just tell me a story. It's not happening right now. Now, when I say that, in Boston, when I was in Massachusetts, I was curious about this topic, and at that time it was a very new topic. People really want to talk about it, but there were small groups, like children of Nazis and the children of the Holocaust survivors. And they experience similar experiences as we have. And so how do they get to the point where they can move on with their lives? So they had researchers working with the two groups separately to tell their stories, to talk about their pain, and then eventually bringing them together. The closest I ever got was the visit to Japan. And Hosei University brought us there. My uncle said, I can forgive, but I will never forget. Inega, he's a Japanese historian, he wrote, the Japanese public wants to forget the unpleasant experience, but he feared that collective amnesia will also erase the costly lessons of war. So you're here today, and the stories are being told so that we don't have to repeat the stories. But it means that we have to change the way we think. And I'll be talking about that shortly. So Japan wanted to pay war reparations to the people, and the US intervened and accepted responsibility, partly because they had just bombed and occupied Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They had occupied Japan. The United States actually occupied Japan. So what usually happens is that you're supposed to take care and pay the people. You're supposed to acknowledge. And that was taken from us by the United States. So acknowledgement of World War II experience continues to be minimized. Consequently, no acknowledgement or restitution or justice has been made. And that's what we were just talking about. We're invisible. Our story doesn't count, doesn't matter, isn't shared, because we're not seen as part of the United States. So, moving right along. Overtaking, reoccupation, invasion, liberation, HITA. All the deaths, the pain, the suffering. Each of those words are evocative depending on your perspective and where you are in your awareness. A lot of people died, yes. The attacks to reclaim Guam. We felt liberated, saved by the Japanese. These are the ones who survived. And even after the initial reoccupation, invasion, they still had to hunt the Japanese down in the jungles and so forth. That's a lot of people. And we forget that on those ships bombarding Guam, there were soldiers Navy personnel of Chamorro descent whose parents lived on the island, whose families were alive and living on the island while they were bombing the heck out of Guam. And so these are two people who have found their family. What a relief that must have been. Salute Marines, Coast Guard for their big part in the invasion of Guam. Did they come to save us? Truly? No, they had to take it back so they could launch. How did you just say it? That we had to be an important part in the the word escapes me, in the efforts throughout the Pacific and Asia in taking over, subduing, winning the war against the Japanese. So we were invaded.